I really hope that with all of the cash they are about to make by selling the new Brutosaur, Blizzard can actually now manage to afford a balanced team for this game, because we have another gigantic balance tuning patch that will hit on the next weekly reset, and again it is proving that the situation is quite weird for many of these specs. The balancing, the nerf, and the buffs being given out left and right to some specs is starting to make less and less sense in the timing that these changes are coming, in the size of some of these changes, the logic behind some of these changes. It does seem like these are sort of just coming off randomly with a rather understaffed team, because many of these don't make too much sense. However, we have to still go over what Blizzard is pushing in the next reset, and we start with the specs we haven't mentioned for a while. We touched when we were talking about, for example, the winners and losers of the patch. We were mentioning that obviously the losers were going to be specs like the Warriors and specs like the Warlocks, who were already at the bottom of the results and even towards the bottom of Mythic Plus damage, that were not going to get any changes. They did not get any changes, and then in this new patch they do get the buffs. So Affliction gets a buff to Hellcaller, which is whatever, because at the moment Hellcaller is not being played and likely will not even after this buff. Agony, Corruption, and Unstable Affliction, so all three of their dots are buffed by 15, 20, and 25%. Now this is going to be some 4-ish% damage increase, because even though those numbers look big, your Agony, your Unstable Affliction, and your Corruption are going to be less than 20% of your damage. Both in single target and even in AoE, in a Mythic Plus run, they are reasonably little damage, so it's not gonna change too much for Affliction. Your AoE damage increasing by 4 to 5% won't change too much about your power in Mythic Plus. Your single target damage increasing by 4 to 5% is also not going to increase much for the spec. There is a more relevant set of buffs for Demo, because after Felguard being buffed, doubling the damage increase, Hand of Gul'dan and Cold Red Stalkers being buffed, you have one of those I told you Blizzard moments with Dreadstalkers now again having a guaranteed chance to give you a demonic core instead of a coin flip. That's the best of the changes for Demo. It's not even the damage increase you're going to be doing from these buffs, it's rather the QOL of your demonic core generation. Because you know between Cold Red Stalkers and Hand of Gul'dan, we are talking about a 3-ish% damage increase. You are not playing Grimoire Felguard to begin with, so this buff is whatever. It's mostly the QOL increase from Dreadstalkers. In terms of numbers, the larger ones compared to Affliction and Demo are to Destro. Again, much like Affliction, you have an attempt from Blizzard to buff Hellcaller, which is also not played for Destro. You have buffs to Chaos Bolt, Immolate, Incinerate, Conflagrate, and Rain of Fire by pretty much a blanket amount. This is a reasonable damage increase, because, for example, all of these combined that you do use very often, so Chaos Bolt, Incinerate, and then Conflagrate, and then Immolate are above 6, almost 7% damage increase for Destro just from these buffs alone. So, considering Destro wasn't doing that well right now to begin with, even amongst the other two Warlock specs, in terms of single target damage, they do have one of the more meaningful buffs given in this patch, definitely the larger one when it comes to Warlocks as a whole. So at least after a while of lamenting the lack of any positive changes for Warlocks, you now have some pretty good buffs coming their way in the next reset. Same goes the way of Warriors, because Warriors were actually not even forgotten by Blizzard, they were actually reminded by Blizzard, except the reminders were nerfs to both Arms and Fury. These are pretty large buffs to Arms and decent buffs to Fury. So for Fury, they are undoing some of the nerfs that went the way of Slayer, and then also buffing Montantane, which is also pretty good for the Mythic Plus version of Fury, and then flat out buffing Bloodthirst, Bloodbath, and Rampage. Now, these three buffs together are barely a 3% damage increase. If you add together Rampage and then Bloodbath and then Bloodthirst, it's not that relevant. It is a larger buff for Fury when it comes to Mythic Plus, because you have the Lightning Strike damage of Montantane, which is buffed by 30%, so this is already almost a 3% damage increase alone, plus you do more damage with Rampage and with Bloodbath in Mythic Plus in just flat out AoE damage increase, so In AoE, it gets closer to being some, 7% plus damage increase for Fury. So the overall performance of Fury in Mythic Plus, especially in AoE, will go up. Similar treatment, even better for arms. You do get buffs to both Colossus and again the similar buffs given back to Slayer, plus buffs to Mortal Strike, Overpower, Dreadnought and Cleave. What is more relevant for them is the global buff they received, which is execute damage increased by 10%. And you being an arms warrior, you do get a freebie 2+% damage increase from your execute, plus the buffs you get from Mortal Strike as well as Overpower in particular. This is a 3% damage increase, this is a 1.5% damage increase, so it's a 3.5% plus the buff to execute, it's 5.5% damage increase at the very minimum in single target, on top of your already existing buffs given back to Slayer. Rip the Storm and Slayer Strike you get when you play Slayer. In AoE, of course, you lose a bit of the damage buff of Execute because it's nowhere near as large, but you gain back the damage given to Cleave, because Cleave also gets a 20% damage buff, as well as Dreadnought, which is within Overpower, but this is much less irrelevant. Overall, it's going to be a slightly larger buff for arms when it comes to single target compared to the damage in AoE. Either way, to both of these specs, there are positive buffs coming the next reset together with the Warlock specs, with the main winner for Warlock being Destro. Now, back alphabetically, we have some of the reverts of the nerfs given to Sun Lane for Blood, which is whatever, and as well as some damage increases to Blood, which is also somewhat whatever. Blood had fallen down to being one of the weaker in terms of DPS for tanks, so okay, understandable set of buffs to Blood. More important are the buffs given to Balance, because we mentioned Balance got a lot of text in the last patch. However, all of this text didn't really amount to much in terms of their damage they were actually going to do. So now you have more buffs across the board. Starfall and Star Surge are both being buffed. Your generators are also being buffed. Your passive damage, shooting stars and crushing stars, is also being buffed. Power of Goldrin is no longer a DPS loss in single target with this buff. On top of this buff, with this nerf, you're not even forced to take New Moon every time as well. This should be overall a larger buff in general for single target than it's gonna be for AoE, which is also good for you because in AoE you weren't nearly as terrible as you were in single target. It's a 2-something% buff in AoE. It's over a 5% damage increase for single target, which is what you would want to see given the performance you have in Mythic Plus compared to the one you are having in the raid for Balance. Now, don't be mistaken just because we were talking nicely about these positive buffs as if it was a good thing from Blizzard. We were still talking about bad things. The buff to DPS warriors needed to happen well before the next reset, and also there was no need to nerf them for the past couple of weeks. Same goes for Warlocks that have been left alone for too long, and the buffs to Balanced Druids are practically an attempt to further help what they were trying to do in the previous patch, which didn't work at all. However, now things get even worse when we talk about Hunters. We mentioned yesterday that Pack Leader, after the changes, especially the rework to Dark Ranger, Pack Leader had overtaken Beast Mastery's pick for the raid, for single target, for Beast Mastery. Well, now, not really. Now you're back to being practically even with Dark Ranger with these changes. Which also means that now Beast Mastery gets a 5% single target nerf to their damage, because Pack Leader was ahead of Dark Ranger. Now it's back to be even. Now you can actually go back picking Dark Ranger even in single target, but you will be 5% weaker. Now this is not, too much of an outrage. Beast Mastery was, after the changes, getting to be one of the best single target specs, so it's not gonna make you that much worse. You're still gonna be a very competitive single target specs. What makes it more awkward is where they mention that Beast Mastery is overperforming in single target, okay, and we would like to reduce its single target while improving its lackluster AoE. So they are nerfing Barb Shot to buff Stomp and Multi-Shot. However, with these changes, on top of these, this still nets out to be an AoE nerf for Beast Mastery. It's like a 1 to 2% AoE nerf. So, it kind of makes you wonder about the competence or the understanding of the changes of the devs themselves, when this is factually not true with these changes for Beast Mastery. More simple and straightforward are the changes to marksmanship. Dark Ranger is overperforming in single target, so they get a whole bunch of nerfs. Now, the reason why this is pretty weird is because this was due to a bug. they were double dipping in mastery for Dark Vengeance marksmanship, and then this bug got fixed in the latest hotfix tuning of Blizzard. However, the spec still gets nerfed based on a performance increase they were having because of a bug. So now the bug is fixed and now they get nerfed, so they practically get a double nerf. The overperformance marksmanship had, the reason why they were even up here to begin with, wasn't even natural. It wasn't even expected to be this good. Now, what made this good had been hotfixed in a nerf, and they still get hit anyways. This is a pretty bad change overall for marksmanship. Now, pretty positive set of changes to Mistweaver. They are slight healing increases. It's just that the situation currently for Mistweaver is so depressing. I doubt this is going to change anything for the spec as a whole. Slight mana nerf to Paladin. Beacon of Virtue and Holy Shock now cost more mana. I've even seen Holy Paladins complain about this. Imagine complaining about this. Discipline gets a bunch of buffs. These though are mostly aimed at your, out of atonement, not being able to target enemies type of healing. So Radiance, Flash Heal, as well as the buff to Premonition of Piety for your Oracle build, which no Discipline Priest player wants to play. So it is a minor change, still positive though for Mythic Plus, where the initial heal of Radiance on your entire party is pretty good to have. Also, the 74th change in 3 expansions of the value of Psychic Link. Now it's back to inflicting 30% of the damage dealt to targets affected by Vampiric Touch instead of 25% in order to help the AoE damage of Shadow Priest, which is not, at the moment, that good. Here is where, though, we enter the worst changes of the day and of the week. We left them for last. We have the Shaman changes. We're not talking about the changes to Resto, getting some more damage when they play Farseer, okay, or even the changes to Enhancement. Enhancement, with the buffs they have gotten, they are performing a bit beyond our goals, so Lightning Bolt is nerfed by 10%, Chain Lightning by 10%, and Stormbringer's Tempest damage is reduced by 15%. Now, up to these nerfs only, we're still in a reasonable territory, okay? In Mythic Plus, for example, Lightning Bolt nerfed by 10%, Chain Lightning by 10%, and Tempest by 15%. Just by the spells themselves, it's barely a 7% nerf, plus the damage they spread to Lightning Rod can get upwards to maybe 10% AoE damage nerf, which is still acceptable. It's given the damage they were doing, it's okay. They were still not the strongest AoE spec, but after the buffs though, they were doing very well. And then in single target you have a similar kind of nerf. This is a almost 3% nerf just for Lightning Bolt alone. It gets another 2.2% nerf from Tempest. So you get close to a 5 to 6% nerf in single target as well, which again, it's okay, it's understandable for Enhancement. Where we go, however, completely overboard are with the changes to Elemental. Now, they are saying the same thing they said for Enhancement, so you're expecting a similar treatment. Some of the changes from 11.0.5 are making Elemental perform beyond our tuning goals, so we are adjusting several talents and abilities to reduce their overall power. One is a positive start by buffing Farseer, because after the tuning it has made Farseer much weaker, so understandable. Where things go wrong though is where Stormbringer Arc Discharge now gives you 1 freebie insta-cast Chain Lightning instead of 2, followed by Voltaic Surge, nerfing your AoE damage by 10% almost by itself, because this is your AoE basically, and now you get 10% less damage increase. Your overloads now do 20% less damage when you take Echo Chamber, and Ascendance gets nerfed by 1/3. From 150% more damage of your overloads to 100%. And then finally, minor changes, 5% less haste when you take Preeminence with Ascendance, and then a minor buff to your single target, buffing Ice Fury damage. This is a disaster for Stormbringer Elemental Shaman. These though are much more heavy-handed than the nerfs given to Enhancement, because what we mentioned when talking about the power of Elemental when they nerfed Lightning Rod for the release of this patch was the fact that Lightning Rod wasn't even the problem. The problem was the feedback loop between your Ascendance and, more importantly, your DRE with your Tempest. Now Tempest is much more powerful because it can overload, it does way more damage than before, and it procs based on the Maelstrom you spend. Ascendance and DRE make you generate a ton of Maelstrom extra because you generate create one additional overload whenever you overload inside of Ascendance. So you get to spend a ton of Maelstrom. Spending a ton of Maelstrom gets you to cast a lot of Tempests. The more Maelstrom you're spending, the more Tempests you're casting. You get to have more chances to proc DRE, because now Ascendance no longer procs just from Lava Burst. It procs from basically everything you cast. So now these nerfs are very major because they increase your cast time of your Chain Lightning. Now you only get one for free, as well as heavy nerfs to your AoE and single target damage. For example, just looking at one of the better Mythic Plus results of an Elemental Shaman, and you can see that overall their damage with Chain Lightning and Earthquake is massive. And this is even larger because a lot of this Lightning Rod damage will come from Chain Lightning as well as Tempest. So these nerfs amount to a 10% single target nerf and a 20+% AoE damage nerf for Elemental. That's where we have a problem, because even if Elemental is massively overperforming at this moment, if you were to nerf the top results, even the top, not even the average, but the top results by over 20%, they would go down to like 1.5-ish, which would bring them much lower down in this bracket of top damage. And if you were to nerf them to their average, they would lose almost 300,000 overall DPS, bringing them to a bit above 1.1 million. And this is just the overall AoE performance. In single target, it gets even worse. In single target, it would be a 10% damage nerf. So right now, they are averaging 1.2 million per median damage. Nerfing them by 10% would be a 120,000 DPS loss, so they would go down to 1,080,000, which would be around here. And don't forget that some of these specs at the bottom have been buffed and are bound to likely pass this number. For example, the two Warlocks, the Balanced Druid, the Warrior will likely also leap over Shaman that falls here, so meaning they will fall another 3 or 4 spots in their performance. That is what is really jarring about the results, is the fact that there are some specs that don't get this treatment, some specs that can stay to be strong for several weeks or even several months without batting an eye on Blizzard's end, and then you have a niche, hipster, underplayed, undertuned, unknown spec like Elemental, who doesn't get to be meta, doesn't get to be strong very often, gets a patch where they are strong, and within 3 days worth of time, the spec gets deleted from the game. Because that is what will happen to Elemental when these changes go live. They will be nowhere near being a competitive enough single target spec, and they will also be a mediocre to average AoE type of spec for Mythic Plus. That's what perhaps is going to irk some players, especially, of course, as usual. I know it's a cheat code, but as usual, when they turn their heads and look at the treatment that Blizzard has been giving, for example, mages, this entire expansion, trying to make sure that one way or another mages always get looked at for, buffed or taken care of, to make sure they get to be meta one way or another, and then you have other specs that just get this kind of treatment. This is definitely the highlight of the day, the sad highlight of the day, the much too heavy-handed nerfs given to Elemental. And alongside a few others are pretty confusing set of changes. Why, for example, did you get so fixated on nerfing the AoE damage of Warriors, constantly nerfing them for weeks and then just having to admit defeat and straight up buffing both of them? Why were Warlocks sort of given very, very tiny changes for several patch notes and then having to resort to buffing them now? Why, for example, has the set of changes given to Hunter been so confusing over the past couple of weeks between what did you want to do and what actually happened, as well as why are certain nerfs happening basing the results of the damage they were doing thanks to a bug, and then you fix the bug but you continue to nerf the spec anyways. So overall, pretty disappointing and pretty confusing set of changes that will go live next reset. Hopefully, of course, since there is still some time, we will see some adjustments to these numbers by the time we get to the weekly reset in like 3 to 4 days. But for today, on this Saturday, this was the recap of what is at the very least planned to go live in a few days as far as balance tuning is concerned. So, with this out of the way, we are now done for the day on this Saturday. Thanks, of course, guys, for watching the video, together with, of course, all of the comrades who supported completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow or tonight to watch some more keys being depleted on stream. And in the meantime, well, it's fine. I went to sleep a little bit sad because it stopped raining after 3 days, and now I wake up and it's raining again.